A very good evening to all our viewers today. We have with us a very special guest coming all the way from Vienna joining us. She is a human rights expert and social sustainability expert based out of Vienna, Austria. She is also the chairperson of the board Paris Lodron Universität Salzburg. She has her master's in international human rights from the University of Notre Dame. Her work focuses on social aspects of sustainability, highlighting the relevance and interconnectedness of human rights across sustainability efforts. Let us all welcome Marianne. Hi, Marianne.
Hi, Harsha. Thank you so much for the invitation. Lovely to see you. And I commend the awesome backdrop that you have there, reminding us all how important it is that we work together on sustainability and sustaining this kind of nature. Yes,
it's an honor to have you with us.
Thanks.
So, Marianne, you have a very interesting profile and you started very early in what you are right now. You have been an ardent law student with more than 2 decades of experience, and now you are into building up human rights policies and law. So, how has your journey been as a change maker in human rights?
Nothing less than a privilege, really, in being able to make people more aware of what a privilege it is to have human rights and what they really mean. And most importantly, and to me, the most treasured part of my work, really to empower people and to watch people sort of grow wings almost and start to soar on their own account, informed by their experience and sharing that and thereby empowering again others. I think that's really the most central part of my work, and that's what keeps me going. And what I've seen repeatedly, and I'm seeing again now in discussions we are having around sustainability, is really paradigm shifts and paradigm shifts that bring more people to the conversation, to the table, enable even better conversations and improve policies that are informed with human rights and that increase the quality of life of people gradually. There are drawbacks, and sometimes you feel that there's a lot of negative things happening, but overall, in those 25 years, I have seen steady progress. And, that reinforces a belief in how we can each learn from each other and grow and be more inclusive and be more accessible. And now in what we do and how we do things. So it's been, as I say, it's been a privilege to have been able to embark on this career and to sustain it in this way for so many years. I will say that when I started out all those years ago, it was my life goal to have a mid-career change that would, entail something entirely different, that we would have made so much progress, that so many people would know human rights so well that it wouldn't need this kind of expertise anymore. And in a way, you might call that a failure now, that's not really possible, or it doesn't seem possible yet. But at the same time, things have changed and the conversation has broadened. And with the ongoing efforts around sustainability, we're really seeing this expansion of the human rights conversation into businesses. And if I think back of my education as a human rights lawyer, you did mention my time at Notre Dame, as they call it in the United States. When Juan Mendez, one of the prolific human rights experts in this world, said to us as students, it shouldn't be corporate social responsibility. It should really be corporate social accountability. And some 2 decades later, we're now seeing that. We're seeing various governments shifting what they require of businesses to report on. And it does include substantial, significant parts of core human rights treaties. And that's nothing short of a paradigm shift. And it's very privileged to be able to be part of that and to try and help people understand that narrative better and make it their own and yeah, make their sustainability if it's more sustainable, as it were. Yeah.
That's very inspiring, Marianne. Being in this space, you must have seen so many cases. What are some of the notable cases that you've observed, and you think that laws are needed, but they are still absent and could be made?
There's a lot that I've seen that I will stop short of sharing, just because it is a profession where you see a lot of things that you don't feel comfortable sharing into an audience where you don't really know who might be watching. And I don't mean to be patronizing. It's just simply you do see a lot of things that are quite shocking. But what I've really seen sort of at the grand scale, at the global scale, in terms of shift, when I entered as an intern into the UN General Assembly for a small Swiss organization called the International Service for Human Rights, there were two things that were very that stood out within the UN system. And one was that it was a very exclusive club of diplomats talking to diplomats about, you know, everyday matters. And the other thing that was, it was such an arcane kind of institution. You know, there was hardly anything on the web. It took days for things to be translated and then printed onto actual paper until they were available. And then within a very short time frame, largely on account of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which was negotiated between 2001 and 2006, all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, there was a lot of hard work and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. Civil society members were really onboarded into these processes. And you had persons with lived experience of disability recognized as experts in their own right and being discussed with and being taken into the conversation on an equal basis, almost, with diplomats. There will always be a hierarchy there, but it was really to see an organization like the UN with all that, if I can term it that, for lack of a better term, folklore, to then really acknowledge this kind of expertise and invite it and openly celebrate it was huge. And then parallel there too, on account of the needs of persons with disabilities, on accessibility requirements for people who are partially sighted or blind, or people who are hard of hearing, all of a sudden documents were made available, you know, overnight. And I'll give you one example because I still think it's one of the most telling ones within the UN system. Negotiations at the UN are always reserved to 3-hour slots twice a day. And then often in the evening, they will sit down and try to come to some kind of a consensus. But those meetings are officially off the record. And particularly if you then share a document that's not translated yet into the UN official languages, there are 6 altogether, you have to make a caveat there. And the then president of the World Federation of the Blind, Kiki Nordstrom, was invited into that conversation and papers were handed out. And given Kiki's blindness, the paper was meaningless to her. And because the repeated requests she made went unheard, one night she attended such a meeting and she handed out her own proposal, which she had printed on a Braille printer. And she handed it out to the diplomats and said, as they did, you know, official translations will be made tomorrow morning. And within 2 weeks, I think, if memory serves me correctly, there was a Braille printer at the UN. And so to see an organization as, you know, as I said, arcane as the UN, move within less than 5 years at that pace, I consider it a huge privilege to have been witness to that. And it is that memory that keeps me optimistic when I see a lot of, challenging, to put it mildly, situations where I do have my doubts sometimes that we are moving in the right direction. But overall, I do have the impression we are.
That's a very nice case study, and I'm sure not only you, and it's needed in so many other government organizations across the globe. And I hope that they start from somewhere. Now, you also served on the Civil Society Board of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights on Human Rights. EU is a coalition of many countries. Now, what are the significant differences or similarities when it comes to human rights?
Oh, that's a big question, Harsha. I'm not sure I can do it justice. Look, there is the starting point from a very legal point of view that some countries have human rights enshrined in their constitution, and that they are an entry point for a lot of legal and policy considerations, and that there is a strong tradition around that. One case in point would be France. Or there is a very recent tradition that has created a lot of change, such as the case of Germany. Or then there is the other example until recently, no longer the United Kingdom, which for a very long time just didn't have any rights enshrined at a constitutional level. So there's that difference in approach. Then there is the whole question of what do people do if they feel that their human rights are violated? The institutional setup for anti-discrimination bodies or any other body where you can share your grievances, be there in your employment relationship, be they in your access to education, be they in the way you get rejected for certain services. There's a whole, I would call it rainbow, a whole spectrum of how people can engage or not engage these kinds of institutions that could provide support. And then, there are the cultural specifics. Some countries find it easier to embrace their history and engage certain minorities, be they ethnic minorities or religious minorities. Other countries find that more difficult. And then within the European Union and globally, you repeatedly have the case of countries being really more or less split into regions, where in some parts you have the impression it's a very vibrant, strong human rights culture, and in others that are adjacent, you all of a sudden have the impression it's really tricky and fraught and hard for people to embrace a human rights culture. But what I see as very beneficial is that in a somewhat comparable situation, such as within the European Union, there are common denominators, there are common efforts to try and improve the situation. There is now a strong understanding across the European Union that human rights are not a tick-off list that you attend to just once or twice a year, but that it's a continuous process to work on improving everybody's human rights and to really come more and more into that perspective where you need to really try as a democracy to walk into the shoes of those people who feel the least safe in your community, and to then improve and change things from their vantage point without being too patronizing and paternalistic, but to really make a genuine effort of engagement and inviting those, in parts, really hard conversations around what makes people feel unsafe, what makes them feel unseen, what do they need in order to feel less stigmatized and accepted as they are into a genuine, meaningful dialogue of participation. And so I think things have shifted around that in no small part due to the European Union agency trying to really invite and instigate cooperation, collaboration among civil society as such, but also with the agency. And that's really what the board of the European Union agency does. It brings the civil society perspective into the agency's human rights work. As we know, a lot of the human rights work still gets done by civil society actors.
Thank you for shedding light on such an important topic and how it is practiced across EU. Well, that itself is a big nation, and I wonder how it would be and the challenges we would be facing in other parts of the world. That could be more complex, and there's a lot of work to be done by the civil society for sure. Um, now, EU has most of its product supply chain market in the emerging markets. If you look at any products that you buy, it's always made in some emerging markets. So when you are also advising any company or the government policies, have you come across cases wherein violations were done and corrective measures were taken in order to address those violations? And if so, would you like to consider any case study with us?
Gladly do that. I don't need to take us back. I just briefly wanted to comment on the fact you mentioned that the complexity might be larger for some countries outside the European Union. And I will ever so slightly disagree with you on that. I think each complexity is one of its own. And some of it, yes, is very much impacted also by a colonialist past. And, you know, the racism and other unfortunate isms that go with that. But I think that the complexity of each country is relative to its history. And I've seen a lot of amazing human rights progress in some places where one didn't expect it. And so I take the view that in many countries, a lot of people are trying really hard to do a lot of good. And yes, sometimes the prevailing system can be very persistent in maintaining its power. I will give you that any moment. But to come back to your question around the supply chain, first of all, I think it's really fantastic that we're finally taking a closer look at the conditions, the human rights conditions around the production of all goods, and that the European Union is pressing so hard to bring about change in that. And then I think it's really of the essence that we will be also looking at those conditions in faraway countries. But I think for all that to be meaningful, what we need to do first is to really ensure that this set of human rights principles is understood as something that applies to all of us. And all of us meaning that those companies that import such goods also understand their own human rights record within their own business. Because I think everything else risks that human rights, which are often perceived as something very abstract and in a way morally and ethically overwhelming, run the risk of coming under the same kind of perspective of othering that so many questions around equality and opportunity do come. And what I find is that the first step is really to make people aware, what are human rights? We talk about them as this one bland term that's very abstract, but what does it actually entail? Are we actually aware? And I would say in the European Union, it's still very happenstance for people to really know what human rights entail, to really get a better understanding that most every aspect of our daily lives is connected in one way or the other to a human right. and that it's not just, labor conditions, and that it's not just safety at work, or the question of equality and diversity that are all somehow in our minds connected to human rights, but that the very fact that we're holding this conversation is part of a whole set of human rights. And so that's my starting point. And I think that's where the first surprises happen, that people start to understand this is not something that, out of where they need to apply something that's very abstract to them to a place that's very far, very remote, very removed from their own lived experience. But that if they then understand, well, this is the whole set of human rights that also need to be upheld in India, in Bangladesh, in Paraguay, that it then makes the conversation easier. And what I have found is that people very quickly then move away from this, oh, this is overwhelming, this is far too much, how are we ever supposed to do that? To okay, how can we now engage these issues? How can we meaningfully convey to our suppliers what's important to us? And I think one of the really important aspects of the considerations that the European Union now has on regulating the supply chain is that they're not proposing to say, if you find a human rights violation, you need to immediately pull out of the contract and find a new supplier. But on the contrary, they're sort of obliging companies to stay in that contract, to have conversations with the supplier, to try and improve the situation and find ways forward. And I think that's what we all need to appreciate, that might become pretty tricky at times, complicated, but that's what we really need to focus on finding more common ground, to appreciate that in the fact that we have a connection through the supply chain, there is already a common ground, there is something that ties us together. And now we need to refocus the way in which we connect on sustainable terms and seek to learn from each other and to really move away also from this rather paternalistic understanding that some people in the European Union know what needs to be done and how it's done rightly, but to really appreciate that there's so much knowledge and practices that are also informative to the way things are done in the European Union and engage these conversations. So what I'm seeing initially, and now I don't have many case stories yet because we're all still waiting for that directive to really come through. And any case study that I would be picking up is something that's already been throughout the media as horrific examples of how important it is that we're finally trying together to change the trajectory, is that people are less concerned in the sense of overwhelmed or worried about the implications of this kind of regulation, and more understanding of an improvement of quality across the board. And I think that's important because that's what I've seen repeatedly throughout my career, that people then get too overwhelmed with fear of doing the wrong thing. I've worked a lot around the integration and inclusion of persons with disabilities, and I've repeatedly seen this. I'm not going to do anything because, there's such a high risk that I'll get it wrong. But then understand, okay, here are some simple steps that you can take, or here is a way of engaging people, and that will help you to then have meaningful conversations and carve a way forward that is even more together. I think that's what's happening.
It's a very good step that they engage in dialogues first. That is far more progressive than just continuing with the said vendor in the supply chain. That's very encouraging and mutually growing. So, I look forward to more such case studies in the coming times. Now, Much ado is being done for the employees who are working from remote locations, spending
Mm.
hours in front of the computer. Now, do you think there should be some human rights policies that could be introduced for the employees who are working remotely? You see, even I'm working remotely, and so are many of my other colleagues. And in this time, it's like hybrid. So, but when they are working from home, they are like even in the middle of the night they are being called. Do you think there should be some ground rules to this?
Well, I think sometimes we need to just acknowledge that there are some ground rules that just have to apply across the board, and not necessarily, invent new rules or come up with a new law, but to really appreciate that there are certain ways we engage with each other and behave that we've actually already agreed on, and that change on account of the fact that the technology has changed and our understanding of how we can work has changed. So I'm always a bit of a skeptic when it comes to creating a new set of rules and creating something different, because then I feel then you have to create a new level of awareness to where actually to find these new rules and how to make them applicable. And then as a lawyer, there's always the question who's in charge of implementation and oversight. Yeah, but I agree with you that particularly with your example of overreaching and calling people at night, just very generally, I think we need to remind ourselves globally on the achievements of worker struggles 100 and 150 years ago, and how we agreed on the fact that there were limits to working hours. And with good reason, and with lots of statistics to back up that people need rest. The human body is only so capable, and I might sound incredibly conservative here now, but to me it is a bit of a go back to the roots and go back to the basic understandings. And yes, some things are very specific around remote work, but then no. An employment contract is an employment contract, and there are certain very basic understandings we have around limiting the reach of the employer and making sure that people have the kind of working conditions for them to be safe, to be productive, as it were, and to be able to sustain that productivity for a prolonged period of time. And I'm always hopeful that people appreciate how much is lost when people are overworked and then have to quit. In that vein, all these notions of mental health and acceptance of certain space might actually feed into common sense, and thereby inform certain decisions. So sorry to not be fully supportive of your idea of having separate rules for remote workers, but to rather really increase the awareness around what the application of common employment standards means for remote workers and other emerging models of modern employment.
Highly appreciate it, and I do agree the complexities shall rather increase when we do that. The United Nations have come up with United Nations guiding principles for human rights. How are we integrating it into business, and how are we measuring and monitoring? So, what are your thoughts on that?
So the challenge has always been that human rights really only apply to states, right? And there's always been a lot of skepticism around whether to expand that notion of application, and if so, how to expand it to businesses, and then to which businesses. And so 2 decades ago, the UN have slowly come up with guiding principles around businesses, and they've been negotiating for almost 10 years now, a possible treaty to address the question of applying human rights directly to businesses. And as a basic guidance tool, the guiding principles are fantastic, because many companies around the world are already engaging them, realizing that a lot of what they're doing in the human resources departments and in their compliance departments actually comes under the UN guiding principles, but it's given them reinforcement, and it has definitely improved situations in many places. And what we're now seeing is that the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines for multinationals are being integrated into corporate requirements. The reporting standards of the European Union are now being expanded to include the UN guiding principles and the OECD standards, and then quite a few other standards to be annually reported in the main accounting report of large companies. And while for the time being, it's only applying to companies of a certain size, it will trickle down and will make the UN guiding principles the absolute core minimum of what businesses need to report on human rights. And the way things are going and the way that this particular directive of the European Union, it's called the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD, is framed. They're wanting to push for even higher human rights standards and really introduce the whole set of human rights treaties by the United Nations, and then some European Union and Council of Europe treaties in addition, which is quite a leap from where the UN guiding principles start, because they only incorporate 2 of the 8 human rights treaties of the United Nations. So we're going places.
Yeah. It's glad that we see that in India also they are taking it very seriously, and many of the companies have started conducting awareness sessions on human rights and doing human rights impact assessments and audits. So we've seen this happening in our country as well. So I'm sure the application will just increase in time. Now, in this phase, as you mentioned earlier, that awareness is a step one. While we as an institute are working on that aspect, what are the knowledge gaps in particular that you have observed, and how do you see that we could collaborate or we could work together, or we need to introduce a particular module in order to address human rights?
I think, as I mentioned before, the first part is to really make people far more comfortable with human rights as such. I still find that the term is very abstract and quite overwhelming, because people put a lot of value on it. They place a lot of value on human rights. They know that it is very important. But in a way, it's then also very loaded, because, you know, if somebody sort of comes up with a human rights violation, this is a very, very strong accusation, and people become almost immovable in response, because it's just so overwhelming. So I stick with the fact that I think we need to really understand, what do human rights mean? What is their application throughout our daily lives? And are we aware that, you know, there's the right to education, there's the right to food, there is the right to housing, there is the right to a basic social adequate standard of living. There's the right to health, which we've all become far more appreciative of over the last 3 years. What does it mean to support diversity? It's, again, a huge term, very meaningful, very colorful, but what are actually grounds of discrimination? How do I navigate a situation when I meet somebody whose life hasn't touched mine yet so far, and then I appreciate that, you know, maybe a person with disabilities needs support, or here I have somebody who might be queer, and how do I navigate that situation without making that person feel uncomfortable? But hang on now, I am feeling uncomfortable. I think there's some of these very basics that we need to work through, and to appreciate that each of them is connected to human rights, and that each of them is connected to each other, and how dependent all of these rights are in their implementation. And that, you know, we can't just talk about the right to education without talking about the right to work, because in most countries around the globe, you need some certain level of financial leverage in order to attain a certain level of education. And so it's all interconnected before we can then start to talk about, well, how does it apply to the workplace specifically, and then in the supply chain. And so I think to have these kinds of conversations, just the way that we are having it now, those are the ones that we need to hold to make people comfortable around talking about human rights is something that applies to each and every one of us, and not just far away, you know, over there, hello, in India, or back down there, over there in somewhere in Burkina Faso, you know, and to come really to the table as also not geographically so bound as I was just now in my example, but to understand how that's all interconnected and needs to be appreciated at an individual level. Yeah.
Wow, that's a lot of work that we also have to start doing, and we have to conduct these kind of sessions more often, as I understand. It has been great communicating with you, learning from you, and exchanging knowledge, more so receiving right now, I must say that. Would you have a message for all our viewers who are watching it right now, or who would watch the recorded session of this?
Yes, please do use your human right of freedom of speech and talk about the importance of human rights. That's a great start. And go spread your awesomeness. Harsha and everybody who's listening. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Marianne. It's an honor to have you with us and learn so much in such a short span of time. We could just keep continuing talking about the subject. But yeah, we should conduct more such sessions.
We'll
Thank
gladly
you.
do. Thank you for having me. A great honor.
Thank you.
Thank you.